It all started with a deathbed promise and a thunderstorm that drove two fugitive Paiute sisters to my doorstep. Before the sun came up, I had to declare them my wives to save them from manhunters, but that desperate move only pulled us deeper into a web of lies, betrayal, and murder. This is the story of how trying to settle a debt forced me to face the shadows I'd spent my life running from. Hello, listeners. How are you doing today? Let us know where you're watching from. Silas Kane felt the storm in his bones long before the sky turned the color of a bad bruise over Copper Mountain. He lived a solitary life on his ranch nestled in the foothills, a life dictated by the seasons and haunted by a promise made to his dying grandfather years ago. The isolation was a choice, a shield against a world he no longer trusted. The promise, however, was a chain, and tonight the first link was about to be tested. A violent crack of thunder rattled the windows of his sturdy log cabin, and the rain began to fall in thick, angry sheets, turning the dusty yard into a river of mud. Just as he was securing the latch on the heavy oak door, a frantic pounding made him freeze. It was not the rhythmic knock of a neighbor, but the desperate, irregular drumming of someone running from their own ghost. Silas grabbed the Winchester rifle resting by the fireplace, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He peered through the small peephole his grandfather had carved decades earlier. Two figures, drenched and shivering, huddled on his porch. They were young women, their dark hair plastered to their faces, their buckskin dresses torn and stained with mud. He recognized them as Paiute from the Dry Creek reservation lands to the south. Silas opened the door just wide enough to speak, the rifle held low but ready. The wind tore at his voice. "What do you want?" The taller of the two sisters, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, stepped forward. "Shelter," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the storm's fury. "Please, just until the storm passes." Silas studied them for a long moment, his gaze taking in their exhausted frames and the backward glances they kept throwing into the darkness. He saw the telltale signs of a long and desperate pursuit, the raw scratches on their arms from running through thick brush, the haunted look that spoke of more than just fear of the weather. They were being hunted. He pulled the door open wider and motioned them inside with the barrel of his rifle. "Get in. Don't drip on the floor." As they stumbled past him into the warmth of the cabin, he saw it, a fresh, ugly bruise blooming on the younger sister's cheek. The image sparked a memory, sharp and unwelcome. He saw his grandfather's weathered face, his eyes clouded with age but his voice firm. "You make this promise, Silas. The old law. You protect the women of their tribe if the Dark Riders come for them. You protect them with marriage, the only shield the white man's law respects." Silas had been a boy then, and the words had seemed like a story. Now, standing in his quiet cabin with two terrified strangers, he felt the immense crushing weight of that promise. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that simply offering them a roof for the night was not going to be nearly enough. The howl of the wind outside was relentless, but Silas Kane's hearing was trained to pick out sounds that did not belong to nature. Beneath the storm's chaotic symphony, he detected the faint, rhythmic squelch of horse hooves slogging through mud. They were not wandering cattle. The pace was too deliberate, too focused. Their pursuers were closing in, using the cover of the storm to mask their approach. He moved away from the door, his face a grim mask in the flickering firelight. The two sisters, huddled by the hearth, watched his every move with wary eyes. The taller one had introduced herself as Nara, and her younger sister as Tabina. "They're close," Silas stated, his voice low and flat. "Maybe half a mile out. The storm won't hold them back for long." Panic flared in Tabina's eyes, and she clutched her sister's arm. Nara, however, met his gaze with a steely resolve that surprised him. "We can run," she said, her voice tight. "We made it this far." Silas shook his head slowly, his knuckles white on the stock of his Winchester. "Running is finished. On this land, my land, there is only one way to protect you that they will be forced to respect." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fill the tense silence of the cabin. "According to the laws of this territory and the customs of your people, I must marry you. Both of you. Right now." Nara and Tabina stared at him as if he had just spoken in a foreign tongue. Disbelief morphed into shock, and then into a cold, familiar fear. "You are just like them," Tabina whispered, her voice trembling with accusation as she backed away from him. "You would use the law to trap us." Silas didn't flinch from her words. He understood their distrust. It was a currency as common as dirt in these parts. Instead of arguing, he pointed with his chin toward a massive, fire-blackened beam that ran the length of his ceiling. Carved into the wood were dozens of symbols, a silent history of the cabin. "Look up there," he commanded. "My grandfather carved those. Warnings, messages for travelers." He pointed to a specific carving, a circle with 3 slashes through it. "That one means manhunters who track women. Your people taught him that sign." He let that sink in before continuing, his voice rough with an old inherited sorrow. "My grandfather lived with your tribe for 10 years after he lost his family. He learned their ways, their laws. He made me promise to honor them." He looked directly at Nara, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about want. I live alone because I choose to. This is about a debt. It's about a promise made to a dying man. On my land, with them as witnesses, a marriage vow makes you family. And no one takes my family." The distant sound of hooves grew louder, a death knell approaching through the rain. The choice was no longer his, and it was barely theirs. It was the only move left on the board. The decision was snatched from their hands a moment later. The cabin door didn't just open, it exploded inward, torn from its leather hinges with a splintering crack that echoed the thunder outside. Framed in the doorway stood a man built like a bull, his face weathered and cruel beneath a dripping, wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, 4 more men fanned out, their revolvers drawn and aimed into the dimly lit room. The leader, a man known in 3 territories as Corbin Vance, let a slow, predatory smile spread across his lips as his eyes landed on the sisters. His voice, when he spoke, was a gravelly rasp that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "Well, look what we have here," Vance drawled, stepping over the threshold as if he owned the place. "A couple of lost lambs and a lonely shepherd." He ignored Silas completely, his focus locked on Nara and Tabina. "I'm here to collect what's mine. These 2 are runaways from the Dry Creek Reservation. Just doing my civic duty bringing them back where they belong." Silas moved without a thought, placing his body squarely between Vance's men and the 2 women. The Winchester came up, the click of the hammer being pulled back dangerously loud in the sudden quiet. "They are on my land now," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm, "and they are under my protection. You and your men will turn around and leave." A tense, suffocating silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Vance chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Protection? You're one man, old-timer. I count 5 guns here, and every one of them is eager to speak." He took another step forward, his smile turning into a sneer. "Besides, you don't know what you're getting into. These aren't just runaways." He gestured dismissively toward the sisters with his pistol. "They're needed for important work up north. The new silver mines. A man has to make a living, and they're part of my living." The words hung in the air, their meaning as clear as it was horrifying. The silver mines were a death sentence, a place from which no one, especially not Paiute women, ever returned. It was a slave camp, plain and simple, sanctioned by greed and enforced by men like Vance. Just as Vance's men began to spread out, ready to end the standoff with violence, Nara made a decision. She saw the grim determination in Silas's eyes and the cruel certainty in Vance's. There was no escape, no place left to run. There was only this one, desperate, impossible chance. Stepping out from behind Silas, she lifted her chin, her voice ringing out with surprising strength. "I accept your offer," she declared, looking straight at Silas. Tabina gasped, but Nara silenced her with a sharp glance. "We accept." In that moment, before the astonished eyes of Corbin Vance and his gang, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from a violent confrontation to a bizarre, impromptu ceremony. Silas, never taking his eyes off Vance, began to speak the words his grandfather had taught him, ancient phrases from the Paiute tradition, mixed with the simple binding language of territorial law. Before these men, before the storm, and under the roof of this home, I take you, Nara, and you, Tabina, to be my wives, he recited, his voice steady and clear. I vow to protect you, to provide for you, and to stand as a shield between you and all who would bring you harm. Nara and Tabina, following her lead, repeated their own vows, their voices trembling but firm, declaring him their husband and his home their sanctuary. It was a strange, hurried ritual, sealed not with a ring, but with the shared threat of death. Vance and his men stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They had come for a capture, not to witness a wedding. They were now involuntary, yet legally binding, witnesses to the union. When the vows were finished, a new kind of silence fell. Vance finally broke it, his face contorting with rage. What kind of trick is this? That means nothing. Silas finally allowed himself a cold, thin smile. It did not reach his eyes. On the contrary, he said calmly, it means everything. He lowered his rifle just an inch. I direct your attention to territorial law, Article 247. It states that a Paiute woman, married to a white citizen and residing on his deeded land, cannot be removed from that land without a direct warrant from a federal marshal. You have no warrant. You have only your greed. Now, for the last time, get off my property. The standoff hung in the air thick and volatile, ready to ignite. Vance was a cornered animal, his legal authority stripped away by a law he had never bothered to learn. His hand tightened on his pistol, his mind clearly weighing the odds of a bloodbath. Before he could make his move, a new sound cut through the night, the deliberate, steady pace of a single horseman approaching the cabin. The rider dismounted, and a moment later, a tall figure filled the broken doorway, his long duster coat dripping water onto the floorboards. He wore a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest. Having some trouble here, gentlemen? The man asked, his voice calm and authoritative as his sharp eyes took in the entire scene. Vance's armed men, Silas with his rifle, and the two shaken women. Corbin Vance's face paled. Marshal Reed, he stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. He immediately tried to regain control of the narrative. Thank heavens you're here, Marshal. This man is harboring fugitives. These two women escaped the reservation, and I was just performing my duty in bringing them in. Marshal Elias Reed didn't even glance at Vance. His attention was fixed on Silas, then on the sisters. He was a man who had seen his share of frontier justice and injustice, and he recognized the smell of lies. He had been tracking Vance's operation for months, waiting for the right moment to close the net. This chaotic scene in a remote cabin was not what he had planned, but it would have to do. Reed slowly unbuttoned his duster, revealing a hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt revolver. Is that so, Vance? You've suddenly become a champion of federal law. The marshal's tone was laced with undisguised sarcasm. He took a step into the room, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. Funny, because my information tells a different story. He reached into an inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, official-looking document, its pages protected from the rain by an oilskin pouch. He let the paper hang from his fingers, drawing out the moment. With everyone watching, he made his stunning announcement. These women aren't fugitives, Marshal Reed declared, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. They are the key witnesses in a federal investigation into the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The marshal's words landed like a physical blow in the small cabin. Corbin Vance stared at the document in Reed's hand as if it were a venomous snake. His entire enterprise, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, was crumbling around him. Marshal Reed let the silence stretch for a moment before he began to explain the situation, his words methodical and precise, each one another nail in Vance's coffin. Their father, a tribal elder named Samuel Blackwood, was my informant, Reed stated, his gaze now fixed on the stunned faces of Nara and Tabina. Shortly before he was murdered last month, he provided federal authorities with a ledger. It contained names, dates, and payments, irrefutable proof of a scheme to sell Paiute women from the reservation to mining camps and work gangs. Reed's eyes hardened as he looked at Vance. You weren't returning fugitives. You were a slaver, Vance, a bottom feeder in a much larger, much filthier pond. The marshal then painted a grim picture of a vast network of corruption. He explained how Indian agents paid to protect the tribes were instead selecting the most vulnerable women. He spoke of territory officials in the capital, men in fine suits who signed falsified documents and took their share of the profits, all while delivering speeches about honor and progress. Vance was just the muscle, the brute who did the dirty work of rounding up the human cattle and delivering them to their fate. His civic duty was nothing more than a cover for a monstrous and profitable trade in human lives. As Reed spoke, Vance's face twisted from disbelief to pure, unadulterated rage. He was not a cunning outlaw in his own right. He was an expendable pawn, and he had just been sacrificed. He saw the trap closing around him, saw the years in a federal prison, or worse, the hangman's noose looming in his future. The revelation of the conspiracy was shocking, but the look on Vance's face was something else entirely. It was the look of a man who had lost everything and was now capable of anything. In that instant, it became terrifyingly clear to everyone in the room that the danger had not passed. It had simply changed its shape, becoming more desperate and far more deadly. With the truth exposed and the law standing before him, Corbin Vance saw only one way out. In a sudden, violent motion, he lunged forward, grabbing Tabina and yanking her in front of him as a human shield. The cold steel of his revolver pressed hard against her temple before anyone could react. "Nobody move," he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. "Drop the guns, or she dies right here, right now," Tabina cried out, a sharp gasp of terror. Nara took an involuntary step forward, her face a mask of horror. Silas and Marshal Reed exchanged a grim look, their hands slowly moving away from their weapons. They had no choice. A single twitch could cost the young woman her life. The tense standoff had been a battle of laws and words. Now it had devolved into a primal struggle for survival. Vance began to back away toward the shattered doorway, dragging the terrified Tabina with him. His eyes darted between Silas and the marshal, wild and cornered. "I'm walking out of here," he snarled, his spit flying. "And she's my ticket. You'll give me a horse and an hour's head start. Anyone follows, and I'll send you back a piece of her." The brutality of his threat hung in the air. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. As he continued his slow retreat, his rage and fear boiled over into a torrent of furious words, a final spiteful act of destruction aimed at the two sisters he could no longer possess. "You think you know the story," he spat, his face contorted in a venomous sneer. "You don't know the half of it." "You think your father was some kind of hero?" Vance yelled, his voice cracking with manic energy as he kept the gun pressed to Tabina's head. "He wasn't. He was an informant, all right, but he was one of us." The words hit Nara and Tabina harder than any physical blow. They stared at him, their faces etched with disbelief and pain. "He sold us information," Vance continued, his confession a desperate, ugly thing. "He told us which families had no men, which women would be easy to take. He got a cut for everyone we took." The story he painted was a sickening portrait of betrayal, shattering the image of the noble father they had mourned. He was twisting the knife, trying to destroy them emotionally, since he could no longer control them physically. Then came the final devastating blow. "And you want to know who killed him?" Vance's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "It was your own flesh and blood. Your uncle, Kenai Blackwood. He found out what your father was doing and killed him to shut him up, to hide the family's shame. He accused their uncle, the man they believed was searching for them, of being the true monster. He's not trying to save you," Vance snarled. "He's hunting you. You're the last ones who know the truth about your sainted father." The revelation struck the sisters with the force of a physical assault, tearing down the very foundation of their world. Everything they thought they knew, everyone they thought they could trust, was a lie. Just as the weight of this new horror threatened to crush them, a sound pierced the night, cutting through the relentless drumming of the rain. It was a howl, long and mournful, but it wasn't the sound of a wolf or a coyote. It was too high-pitched, too deliberate. It was a a chilling human cry that echoed through the canyon, promising that the night's violence was far from over. Vance's head snapped toward the sound, a flicker of new fear in his eyes. He wasn't the only hunter in these woods. The howl from the darkness momentarily distracted Vance, and in that split second of hesitation, Tabina acted. Driven by pure instinct, she drove her elbow backward with all her might, striking him hard in the ribs. Vance grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just an instant. It was all the opening they needed. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, one from Silas's Winchester and the other from Marshall Reed's Colt. Both bullets found their mark, one tearing through Vance's shoulder, the other through his leg. He screamed and crumpled to the floor, releasing Tabina, who scrambled away toward her sister. Before the echoes of the gunshots had faded, a new figure appeared in the broken doorway, seeming to materialize from the storm itself. He was a tall Paiute man, lean and weathered, with eyes that held the quiet, deadly patience of a predator. He moved with a silence that was unnerving, his gaze sweeping over the scene and taking in every detail. It was Kenai Blackwood. Vance, bleeding on the floor, looked up at him with a mixture of terror and hatred. "I told them," Vance gurgled, clutching his wounded shoulder. "I told them it was you." Kenai ignored him, his attention fixed on his nieces. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice low and steady. He then looked at Vance, his expression unreadable. He speaks with a forked tongue, twisting the truth to save his own skin. Kenai's words were calm, but they carried an undeniable authority. "Your father did give them information," he admitted, his gaze softening as he looked at Nara and Tabina. The confirmation of this part of the betrayal was a fresh wound. "But he did it because they had your mother. They took her, and they threatened to kill her if he did not cooperate. When he finally refused to help them any longer, they murdered her, and then they murdered him." The truth was far more complex and tragic than Vance's spiteful version. Their father hadn't been a traitor. He had been a victim, trapped in an impossible situation. "I was not hunting you," Kenai continued, his voice firm. "I was tracking you, to protect you. It was your father's last wish." Marshall Reed, his pistol still trained on the groaning men on the floor, looked at Kenai with a newfound respect. "The evidence," Reed said, more a statement than a question. "The ledger your brother started. You're the one who finished it and got it to my office in the Capitol." Kenai gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My brother sought to fight them with their own laws," he explained. "When they killed him, I knew I had to finish his work. Justice, not vengeance. That is the honorable path." He revealed that he had spent weeks tracking Vance's gang, gathering more evidence, and documenting their movements, all while trying to find his nieces before Vance could. "The howl," Silas said, finally lowering his rifle. "That wasn't your signal to attack." Kenai shook his head. "It was a warning," he replied, his eyes turning toward the dark, stormy night outside. "I was not just tracking Vance. I was tracking another group that was following him, men sent by the agent at the Bureau to make sure there were no loose ends. In that moment, it became clear that Vance and his men were just the first wave. A cleanup crew was on its way to eliminate everyone in the cabin, including Vance himself. Just as this chilling realization settled in, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop reached them. For a heart-stopping second, they thought Kenai's warning had come too late. But the riders who appeared out of the rainy darkness were not assassins. They were uniformed soldiers, their yellow striped trousers and military discipline a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. It was a cavalry patrol, their captain dismounting and striding into the cabin. He saluted Marshall Reed. "Marshall, we received your message. Looks like we got here just in time." Reed nodded, holstering his weapon. "Your timing is perfect, Captain." The siege was over. Thanks to the combined efforts of a federal marshal, a grieving brother seeking justice, and a reclusive rancher honoring a promise, the entire corrupt network had been brought down in a single night. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the clouds, the cabin was a scene of controlled chaos. The wounded Corbin Vance and his men were bound and being loaded onto cavalry horses for the long ride to a federal jail. The captain of the cavalry patrol confirmed Marshall Reed's story, explaining that simultaneous raids, based on the information Kenai had provided, were happening across the territory, rounding up everyone from the corrupt Indian agent to the officials in the capital. The conspiracy was not just exposed, it was shattered. With the immediate threat gone, a different kind of tension settled over the cabin's occupants. The adrenaline faded, leaving exhaustion and the raw, aching wounds of the night's revelations in its place. Kenai Blackwood, after ensuring his nieces were truly safe, turned his steady gaze upon Silas. "The vows you spoke," he said, his voice quiet but direct. "They were spoken to give my nieces the protection of the law. The law has done its work now. Was it only for protection?" The question hung in the air, aimed at Silas but intended for everyone. Silas looked at Nara. Their eyes met across the small, cluttered room. In the span of a single, terrifying night, they had faced death together, become witnesses to each other's strength and vulnerability. A bond had been forged in the crucible of that storm, something deeper and more real than a mere legal arrangement. He saw in her eyes not just gratitude, but a flicker of something more, a shared understanding, a quiet strength that matched his own. She was the one who answered her uncle. "It began as protection," Nara said, her voice clear and unwavering as she held Silas's gaze. "But it could become something more, if he is willing." Silas Kane, a man who had built his life around solitude, who had sought peace in the silence of the mountains, found himself facing a future he had never imagined. He had been a protector, a role thrust upon him by a promise. Now he was being offered a new role, a husband, a partner, a member of a family. He looked at Nara, at the resilient young woman who had accepted a stranger's impossible proposal to survive, and at Tabina, who was already beginning to heal under her sister's care. He looked at Kenai, a man of profound honor. He realized that the promise to his grandfather had not been a burden after all. It had been a map, leading him out of his self-imposed exile and toward something he hadn't known he was missing. With a slow, deliberate nod, he accepted. "I am," he said. And in those two simple words, he sealed his honor and chose his new life. 6 months later, the ranch at the foot of Copper Mountain was a different place. The splintered, broken door had been replaced with one made of sturdy, reinforced pine, built by Silas and Kenai working together. Inside the cabin, the bachelor's sparse and dusty existence had given way to the organized warmth of a home. Woven Paiute blankets added color to the walls, and the scent of roasting herbs often mingled with the smell of wood smoke. The ranch was no longer a fortress for one man's solitude. It was a sanctuary for a family. Kenai had stayed, his quiet presence a source of strength and stability. He and Silas worked the ranch as partners, their skills complementing each other perfectly. Silas knew the land, the weather, and the ways of the settlers, while Kenai brought his deep knowledge of the mountains, of hunting, and of the Paiute traditions that were now woven into the fabric of their daily lives. They were an unusual family, forged in violence and bound by a shared trauma, but they were strong. The marriage that had begun as a legal fiction, a desperate gambit in the face of death, had blossomed into a true and deeply felt partnership. The respect between Silas and Nara had grown into a quiet affection, a bond built on shared glances, unspoken understanding, and the simple comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. Tabina, her laughter now heard more often than her fearful whispers, was healing, finding safety, and a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. Silas Kane, the mountain man who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, often found himself watching his new family, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. He had learned that the promise to his grandfather was not about being a lone shield against the darkness. It was about opening a door during a storm and discovering that true strength isn't found in isolation, but in the courage to build a home worth defending.